Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumber here again for JoBlo.com with another edition of James Bond Revisited. And this time we're going to do something really cool. We're going to count down the top 10 ever best James Bond girls. Yes, that's right, all the Bond girls coming right up. But before we get to the list, let me just say one thing. We are not including villainesses because they were already on the James Bond villain list, including of course Famke Janssen's Xenia Onatopp, who most certainly would have made this list if she hadn't already been included in the villains list, and well, nobody gets onto the list twice. So without further ado, kicking off the best ever James Bond girls with number 10, who's probably going to be a bit of a controversial choice, but it's Carol Bouquet as Melina Havelock in For Your Eyes Only. Now, something interesting started to happen with Roger Moore as he got older. And one of the things about him is that he was in his mid-50s already by the time he made Moonraker, and by the time he made For Your Eyes Only, he was about 54 years old. He wasn't a young guy. So what they started to do was they started to tone down his randiness a little bit. And if you watch For Your Eyes Only, he's actually pretty mature in this film. He doesn't jump into bed with every Bond girl he sees. Lynn Holly Johnson's character, who's in her 20s and a skater, tries to seduce him, and of course he tells her he's just going to buy her some ice cream instead.
I don't think your Uncle Harry would approve.
Him? He thinks I'm still a virgin.
Yes, well, you get your clothes on. I'll buy you an ice cream.
He does sleep with Cassandra Harris's Countess von Liesel and Carol Bouquet's Melina, but of course Melina is the main James Bond girl in this film, and Bond never really pursues her romantically until kind of the end of the film, because you see, her parents have been killed and she wants revenge. In this movie, she's in kind of a fragile emotional state, and I think that Bond realizes this and tones down the womanizing a little bit. It's an interesting thing to note because at the beginning of the movie, he visits the grave of his late wife. In the Roger Moore Bond movies, they would acknowledge the fact that, On Her Majesty's Secret Service with George Lazenby actually did happen, and that Bond suffers from the fact that he's a widow. So in this film, he's kind of already in that darker frame of mind, and of course it is a much darker James Bond film than a lot of the other Roger Moore films with him killing hitmen in cold blood and so on and so forth. But I think that Carol Bouquet is really good as Melina, even though she's dubbed, and I have to say some of her action scenes are quite good, such as the beginning of the film where she kills the assassin that murdered her parents. It's pretty badass, and I love her weapon, the crossbow.
For your eyes only, darling.
Number 9 is Isabella Scorupco's Natalia Simonova, a programmer at the Severnaya lab who survives the GoldenEye attack on the control center and ends up being kind of the default Bond girl. For most of the movie, her and Pierce Brosnan keep it kind of low-key. She's supposed to be kind of this mousy lab technician. Of course, they get to Cuba, she wears a bikini, she looks unbelievably hot, they have sex. I mean, it's a James Bond movie after all, right? I don't know many computer programmers that look like Isabella Scorupco, but I always thought that she was quite good in this film, and she kind of saves the day at the end of the movie with her knowledge of programming. Of course, she does get overshadowed a little bit by Famke Janssen's Xenia Onatopp, but I think she holds her own, especially towards the end of the movie, where she tries to fight off Famke Janssen and has that great moment where Famke kind of takes her and says, "Wait for your turn," which when I was a kid, I thought was really cool. She's the primary Bond girl in this movie, and she's a really good one.
Boris! Boris!
What?
Coming in at number 8, another controversial choice, Sophie Marceau as Electra King. Now, this is kind of the first Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie where you can see he gets emotionally involved with a woman, and of course Electra King is kind of loosely based on Patty Hearst. She's been kidnapped, she's been turned over to the side of the villains, and of course is fragile and flawed. In some ways, she kind of ends up becoming the main villain in this movie, although not technically, I guess, it's still Renard. But I always thought that Marceau was amazing in this film, and I really liked the chemistry that she had with Pierce Brosnan. You feel in the movie that he's actually falling in love with her. The biggest mistake they made, of course, was when she eventually kind of betrays Bond. Bond just immediately jumps into bed with Denise Richards, Dr. Christmas Jones, who, of course, is beautiful, but is a terrible character and probably one of the worst Bond girls ever in terms of a storyline or premise. So it kind of ruins the impact that relationship had. But on the whole, I have to say Sophie Marceau is terrific in this movie, and of course looks great too.
You're determined to protect me, aren't you?
Perhaps from yourself. You don't have to do this.
There's no point in living if you can't feel alive.
Number 7 is one that not everybody's going to agree with me on, but Maud Adams as Octopussy. Now, as I said, Roger Moore was getting a little bit long in the tooth by the time he made some of his later James Bond movies, but I really like the fact that they kind of acknowledge it. You know, there's nothing wrong with James Bond being in his 50s or even in his 60s, as long as you kind of adjust the formula a little bit. So in this movie, he got a love interest that was at least a little bit closer to his age than normal, with Maud Adams at the time, I think, being around 39. She's terrific as kind of this kingpin on her own. She runs a team of gorgeous smugglers working for the circus, and she has really good chemistry with Roger Moore, and I especially like the fact that kind of her whole premise is taken right out of the Ian Fleming novels, where her father was a secret agent that betrayed the government and was offered an honorable suicide by James Bond, and instead of wanting revenge, she kind of wants to jump his bones, right? I always thought that Maud Adams seemed to kind of have a thing for Roger Moore, and it comes across in this film. The two of them have terrific chemistry together, and it's no surprise that Maud Adams is really the only James Bond girl to be in 2 movies as 2 separate characters. Pretty cool.
I wondered when you might arrive.
So you are the mysterious Octopussy.
And you are James Bond.
Number 6 is Barbara Bach as Major Anya Amasova, aka Triple X. Now, this was the first James Bond movie where you got Bond paired up with another secret agent, or at least a Bond girl that was kind of on an even keel. You see, the thing is, she's a badass in her own right and an amazing agent. She's the top agent of the Soviet Union, and her and Bond have kind of this interesting little cat and mouse game that they're doing early in the film. Of course, you know, they immediately decide to work together and things go a lot better as she becomes an ally, but then they throw an interesting wrinkle in. The fact is, her lover was actually killed by James Bond in a mission in the teaser, and then she decides that after the mission's over, she's going to kill James Bond.
The answer to the question is yes. I did kill him.
Then, when this mission is over, I will kill you.
Now, Barbara Bach's acting in this movie is a little bit wooden, but I actually think it kind of works for this repressed Soviet character. And I have to say, the first time I watched the movie, I wasn't so sure that she was just going to immediately melt into James Bond's arms at the end of the movie, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, it's a James Bond movie. I figured she wasn't going to kill him, but she does seem pretty angry with him, and towards the end, you know, you really don't know what's going to happen. I always thought that she was a great character and probably should have been brought back, but alas, they weren't really doing that back then. I have to think that if Anya Amasova was a character nowadays, she'd probably get her own spin-off franchise or at least become a recurring character. But things are done a little bit differently now than they were back in 1977.
007, Triple X. Bond, what do you think you're doing?
Keeping the British end up, sir.
Number 5 is the original James Bond girl, Ursula Andress. Now, Honey Rider is definitely not the most intriguing James Bond girl ever. I mean, she's kind of childlike and kind of thinly written, but my god, that scene where Ursula Andress emerges on the beach in the white bikini with the knife is just one of the most iconic sequences in cinema history, and for that alone, you really got to put her on this list. Again, Honey's barely in the movie. She really only becomes a big presence in the plot in the last half hour, and it's a very thinly written character, and not very well dubbed either. That's not Ursula Andress' actual voice. But, you know, the visual aspect alone and the fact that she's so iconic, she really needs to be on the list.
Are you alone?
What are you doing here? Looking for shells?
No, I'm just looking.
Number 4, a more modern Bond girl, Halle Berry as Jinx, who actually almost got her own spin-off in a movie that was going to be directed by Stephen Frears. Alas, a little movie called Catwoman came along and kind of ruined Halle Berry's career as an action star for a little while at least. Now, Die Another Day is probably the worst James Bond movie ever made, but Halle Berry had just won an Oscar and really is giving it her all, and I think that had she been allowed to make an action movie, this would have been the thing that would have kind of launched her, as opposed to something like Catwoman. I mean, you have to wonder, if she chose Catwoman over doing Jinx, there was a problem there, but I don't think that actually was the case at all. I think things just kind of fell apart, unfortunately. Jinx is a great character. Halle Berry looks amazing in her orange bikini, which of course pays tribute to the James Bond girl that we just mentioned, Ursula Andress. I also have to mention that Rosamund Pike in this film is absolutely gorgeous as Miranda Frost, but of course, she's a villainess and not a true James Bond girl.
I take it Mr. Bond's been explaining his Big Bang Theory.
Oh, yeah, I think I got the thrust of it.
Number 3 is probably the most important James Bond girl of all time, Diana Rigg as Countessa Tracy DiVincenzo, aka Mrs. James Bond, for a little while anyway. Now, you see, in 1969, George Lazenby was taking over the role of James Bond and was a complete unknown. So for the Bond girl, they wanted a big star. Brigitte Bardot was apparently originally approached, didn't work out, but they went with Diana Rigg, who was very famous at the time for playing Emma Peel on The Avengers, who was kind of like the female James Bond. In the movie, she plays the one woman that James Bond ever truly falls in love with, and they get married, and I think that Diana Rigg is terrific in this movie. One thing that's kind of cool is, considering how physically able she was and capable, they did give her some fight scenes towards the end of the movie, which are pretty nifty. Again, this movie ends every time I want Tracy to get away, but she always ends up dying. It's just is what it is.
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
Number 2 is kind of an off-kilter choice, but I gotta say, I've always had a thing for Carrie Lowell as Pam Bouvier in License to Kill, one of my favorite James Bond movies ever that I think a lot of people just ignore. So this is another Bond girl who's probably as badass or even more so than James Bond is in this movie. I mean, she gets the best kill throwing Benicio del Toro down the coke shredder, which is just completely insane and cold-blooded, and my god, is she ever beautiful. I thought she looked good in this movie at the beginning when you first see her, but man, there's a part in the movie where they reveal her with short hair and impeccably tailored. It's a jaw-dropping moment, and you see like Timothy Dalton's double take when he sees how good she looks with the short hair, and it's hilarious because, man, could Carrie Lowell ever pull off that hairdo? She's really great in this movie. I love the character, I love her in the role, and I'm surprised that she didn't go on to have a much bigger career on the big screen, although of course she was on Law & Order for quite a while afterwards. And Richard Gere got to marry her, for a while anyway. What a lucky guy.
You lucky bastard.
And number 1 is probably my favorite James Bond girl of all time, and another one that I would say is very important to the character. Vesper Lynd Eva Green in Casino Royale.
Perfection.
Now, Eva Green is the whole package in this movie. I mean, look at her. She's absolutely gorgeous, but Vesper Lynd is such a great character. Much more interesting than she is on the page in Ian Fleming's original novel. You see, she's somebody that had a lover who betrayed her and now has to betray James Bond, and she's a really tortured character in the film. She's very three-dimensional. You can see her actually falling in love with James Bond throughout the movie, and James Bond is falling in love with her too. She's there for him after his, private parts have essentially been, deactivated to a certain extent by Le Chiffre, but she's the one who gives him back his virility and his potency, so there you go. If anyone could do it. I do love her in this movie. I think she gives the character a real tragic edge that makes the ending of the movie kind of devastating, especially when he tells M,
"Why should I need more time? Job's done. The bitch is dead."
I mean, what a cold-blooded line, but Eva Green is so good in this movie. Again, I don't understand why Eva Green isn't one of the biggest stars in the world, because she's got it all.
You've got your armor back on. That's that.
I have no armor left. You stripped it from me.
Alright everybody, it's Chris Bumray here again for JoBlo with another James Bond Revisited Top 10. And this time we're taking a look at something that is forever linked with the James Bond franchise, James Bond gadgets. So without further ado, here are our top 10 James Bond gadgets. Coming in at number 10 is one that I think probably a lot of you aren't necessarily going to remember, but it's one that I definitely remember, and it's the TV watch from Octopussy. So, in this movie, Bond has basically got little cameras set up and he can watch TV on his watch, which, I mean, now is not a big deal. I mean, we can all watch TV on our smartphones, but back then, I mean, watching something on your watch was considered insane.
A style watch. You could watch TV on it.
Why would you want to watch TV on your watch?
I don't know.
And in fact, Seiko put out a TV on a watch around the time that this movie came in, and in fact it was a promo tie-in, but man, if you watch the TV spots for this, it was not the coolest TV in the world. I mean, it was this little black and white TV where you could barely see anything on screen. Definitely technology was not able to keep up with their imaginations at this point, so I still think though that the TV watch was pretty neat, because I used to watch Octopussy and dream of the day that I'd be able to watch TV on my watch.
Perfect image, Q.
Really, 007.
Coming in at number 9 is actually a villainous weapon or a villain's gadget, the garrote watch from Russia with Love. So Robert Shaw's character in the movie basically goes around with this really cool watch that if you pull on it, piano wire comes out, and he uses it to strangle people. So this is Red Grant's trademark, of course. He strangles people with piano wire that comes from his watch. And of course, like all evil villainous gadgets, it gets turned around on the bad guys at the end, because if anybody's a master of gadgetry, it's James Bond. So Red Grant ends up getting strangled with his own watch, and in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, you actually see George Lazenby going through his office as James Bond, and he actually has kept the garrote watch as a souvenir. And I'm not surprised, because it's pretty cool. I mean, if you want to kill somebody in close quarters, that's the way to do it. Number 8. So James Bond, up into the Pierce Brosnan era, was a pretty heavy smoker in films. Smoking was just always kind of associated with James Bond. It's very un-PC these days, and I can understand why people are very reluctant to ever have James Bond smoke again, because smoking is actually terrible for you. I smoked for years. It was bad. I'm glad that I don't smoke anymore. That said, the cigarettes did give them the opportunity to create a couple of really interesting gadgets, and You Only Live Twice has a couple of really cool ones. So Bond basically goes to Tiger Tanaka's ninja headquarters and sees all their weaponry, and what they've got are these little rocket cigarette guns. So this is kind of perfectly designed for James Bond, because he's a heavy smoker, and there's a really cool scene at the end of the movie where he's got one of these little rockets, and he convinces Spectre to allow him to have one last cigarette before they kill him. Of course, it's a rocket cigarette. Blofeld thinks he has the last laugh by basically telling James Bond it's not the tobacco that'll kill you, but alas, they don't realize that Bond has got this little minigun, even though it looks totally fake, and he shoots it and escapes and then saves the world, all thanks to smoking. So I don't know, maybe the James Bond movies, the early ones, weren't necessarily the best advertisement against smoking.
It can save your life, this cigarette.
You sound like a commercial.
Moving to number 7 is another Sean Connery gadget, the underwater breather from Thunderball. So in this movie, whenever James Bond loses his aqua lungs, he basically pulls out his little mini breather and puts it in his mouth. It looks like a pen that he's just sucking on, and it gives him an emergency supply of oxygen. And apparently the Royal Engineers, the British Navy, actually thought this was a really cool gadget and contacted the producers to find out how they did it. Of course, it turned out that the prop really had no air in it at all, and all the actors were actually just holding their breath. So didn't actually work. Man, if something like that did work to give you a little reserve of oxygen, it'd be pretty cool. And Bond looks awesome with it in his mouth. I always really dug the way that looked. In fact, I used to often put pens in my mouth and pretend they were little mini rebreathers when I was a kid. Yes, that's how cool I was. Getting to number 6 is a gadget that actually showed up in 2 James Bond movies with varying degrees of success. So the first time X-ray glasses showed up were when Roger Moore tried to use them in A View to a Kill, and they looked terrible. I mean, he puts them on his face, they look so heavy, he's trying to hold the lenses together. This is not fooling anyone, and it makes him probably the worst spy of all time. You know, my girlfriend has always told me that she thinks that James Bond, as amazing as he is actually a pretty terrible spy, because he always gets his cover blown or always gets captured. And definitely if you see him with the X-ray glasses in A View to a Kill, doesn't surprise you why he always gets captured, right? But the X-ray glasses show up again in The World Is Not Enough, and man, are they ever cool. So they're tinted blue, and I loved the look of the sunglasses so much that I tried to find them everywhere when The World Is Not Enough came out. And I was really excited because I think at the time Oakley was doing these cool tie-in James Bond sunglasses, and they had a pair that was coming out for The World Is Not Enough. Of course, when I found them, it turned out they were just kind of the wraparound shades that were really popular at the time and that James Bond uses in the ski chase. So I was left disappointed by The World Is Not Enough in more ways than one. That said, I always really love the blue tinted lenses. I think they're super cool, and Pierce Brosnan looks amazing in them. Coming in at number 5 is another Pierce Brosnan gadget, the BMW from Tomorrow Never Dies. So it's a BMW 750iL, and in it, James Bond is able to control it using his Sony Ericsson phone. It has a little LCD screen and a trackpad, which in 1997 was really cool. I mean, now it looks old-fashioned as heck, but you know, back then it was pretty neat, and it's an awesome car chase because he's driving from the backseat on his phone, and they've got that great propeller head soundtrack song, Backseat Driver, which I used to love when I was younger.
Congratulations on a safe journey.
Moving to number 4 is one of my favorite James Bond gadgets of all time, the wrist dart gun from Moonraker. So basically, Q gives James Bond what looks like a watch, but it's got a little gun attached to it, and when he flicks up his wrist, it shoots out a dart. There are 2 kinds of darts, steel-tipped and poison-tipped, and he uses both in the movie. At one point, Bond is trapped in a centrifuge, and he uses the steel-tipped darts to escape. At the end of the movie, when he faces off with Drax, he uses one of the poison-tipped darts, shoots him in the heart. So, I always thought this was so cool, and when I was a kid, I used to always wear a wristwatch, and I used to just attach a pen to it sometimes and flick my wrist around thinking that I was James Bond. Yes, it's true. When kids my age were all dressing up as Batman, I was dressing up as Roger Moore, circa 1979, all discoed out in Moonraker. Yeah, that's the kind of kid I was. Moving on to number 3 is another really famous James Bond gadget, the Bell Aerostar jetpack from Thunderball, which is actually real. Yes, this jetpack worked, but only for about 20 seconds at a time. So in the movie, it's used in a really lame way. Bond is basically on a balcony and uses a jetpack to fly away, and it's just kind of up and down, and it's so kind of clunky. It doesn't exactly make him look like the Rocketeer, but hey, it's a jetpack, and in 1965, a jetpack must have seemed like the coolest thing ever. Heck, I mean, I think that's what kind of cinched it for me with the franchise, because it was my first ever James Bond movie. I mean, he was wearing a jetpack like G.I. Joe. It was so cool. Moving on to number 2 is a car, the Lotus Esprit. Now, everybody always debates what's better, the Aston Martin DB5 or the Lotus, and well, my answer is going to be apparent in a couple of seconds, but the Lotus, I think, is the perfect car for Roger Moore. I mean, in the 1970s, James Bond, you know, he looks a lot different than Sean Connery did. I mean, he's wearing bell-bottom pants, he wears kind of a leisure suit in one of his movies, and, you know, him driving a white Lotus Esprit that looks like it came out of Studio 54 is quite appropriate, especially with the Marvin Hamlish disco-flavored Bond 77 on the soundtrack. And it's a really cool little car. He's able to use it as a submarine, it shoots missiles. I always thought it was amazing. I love when he drives out of the water and this guy is kind of looking at his wine because he can't believe that he's wondering what he drank because the car has come out of the water and Bond throws a fish out the window. It's great, and it's very Roger Moore. The Lotus does show up again in For Your Eyes Only, but it's painted a disgusting shade of rust, which I absolutely hated. And funny enough, when a friend of my mother's visited the UK, she brought me back some James Bond model cars, but the only Lotus that they could find was the rust-colored one from For Your Eyes Only, because guess what? Nobody wanted that one. Moving on to number 1, however, is the James Bond gadget, I think, that started it all and probably popularized the character as an action hero. The Aston Martin DB5, which of course showed up in Goldfinger during the first ever extended Q branch sequence. So in this part, Q is showing Bond around his laboratory. It's amazing. All kinds of crazy stuff is happening, and he gives him a rundown of the car, which includes an oil slick, machine guns, a bulletproof screen, and the thing that really blows James Bond away, an ejector seat.
Ejector seat? You're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
The car chase in this movie, where he's using all the gadgets, probably blew people away in 1964. I mean, I don't think people give James Bond enough credit in the fact that he was the first ever modern action star. I mean, if you think of guys that were known for action back in the early 60s and late 50s, I mean, who do you have? Humphrey Bogart, Gregory Peck, John Wayne? Did you ever see them driving around cars with machine guns coming out of them and, you know, ejector seats? Not really, right? I mean, Sean Connery as James Bond was the action star that paved the way for all the modern action stars that we know these days, and without him, they just don't exist. Even Indiana Jones would not exist without James Bond. And I think in some ways, the Aston Martin DB5 is what is responsible for this. So that, for me, definitely takes the position of number 1 for the greatest James Bond gadget of all time. Of course, I'm sure that I've missed a lot of them. There are some really cool ones that I've missed, such as the whistling keychain from The Living Daylights. I used to always do that whistle when I was a kid. Another one gadget that I was kind of thinking about putting on the list, but I didn't because in the end it turned out to not be very useful, was the kind of X-ray Polaroid gun that they use in License to Kill. So it shoots a laser beam and takes X-ray photographs. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to kill somebody by taking a Polaroid of them, if you miss them with the laser, you would probably kill them with the radiation. I mean, it's an X-ray, right? Maybe not the coolest gadget of all time, but it is still kind of nifty. And I love the James Bond series. I love all the gadgets, even the really stupid ones. They're all amazing in their own way. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another edition of James Bond Revisited. And this week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're counting down the top 10 greatest James Bond villains of all time. And yes, I am including henchmen and henchwomen. So, I apologize if I've missed your favorite, but here are my top 10. Coming in at number 10 is Le Chiffre. And of course, I'm talking about Mads Mikkelsen's performance as Le Chiffre, as in point of fact, due to a complicated legal rights situation, Mikkelsen was not the first actor to play the part. Peter Lorre actually played him in a CBS Climax Theater TV version of the book, while Orson Welles played him in the big-budget 007 spoof version of Casino Royale, which, strangely enough, is actually my most popular James Bond Revisited video ever. Martin Campbell directed the performances of no less than 3 of my top 10 Bond villains, and I think what makes his villains so good is how grounded he keeps them, while also making them a credible physical threat to Bond. Mikkelsen has a great look with the scar and the bleeding tear duct, but there's a humanity to him in that he's desperate. When Bond cleans him out at the tables, he knows he's marked for death, and his desperate act against Bond, where he nearly destroys his testicles with a carpet beater, is one of the most cringe-inducing moments of the franchise, and I have to mention, straight out of Ian Fleming. I don't think any guy went to see Casino Royale and didn't cross their legs in this sequence. It is nerve-wracking.
No! No! To the right! To the right! To the right! You are a funny man, Mr. Bond.
Number 9 is going to be a very controversial choice, Grace Jones's Mayday. Now, hear me out. She's one of, I think, a recurring motif in this video, hench people that overshadow the main villain. Now, this may sound like sacrilege, as I know people love Christopher Walken as Max Zorn, but I never found that character to be all that interesting. He's basically just an 80s ripoff of Goldfinger, except instead of gold, you've got microchips. Yet Mayday, as played by Grace Jones, was something different. Now, Roger Moore always had this kind of jocular, buddy-buddy kind of relationship with everybody on set, you know, and it seemed like everybody really liked him, but one of the few people he didn't get along with was Grace Jones. In fact, apparently they despised each other off screen, but that kind of leads to some intriguing energy between the two, especially when they have sex in a really uncomfortable moment. Jones also strikes a really sympathetic note, especially towards the end when she's been betrayed by Zorin and actually becomes kind of a good guy. And Moore is playing opposite her in the final act, doing something kind of different for Roger Moore. He's acting. I love Roger Moore, but you know, heavy lifting in terms of drama isn't necessarily really his thing in the James Bond movies. He kind of plays it cool and easygoing. But you know, at the end of View to a Kill, he really has to kind of evoke some sympathy, and it's pretty interesting. Also, she looks really cool. I mean, I love that hair, the outfits, it's really neat. Number 8, another henchman, but man, one of the best. Richard Kiel's Jaws, made for an unforgettable sight. 7'2" with a mouthful of steel teeth. A lot of kids are probably afraid of him, but I wanted to be Jaws' best friend. The fight between Bond and Kiel on the train in Spy Who Loved Me is a classic, and everyone knew they had such a good thing going with Richard Kiel, they let him live. Sadly, the impact of the character was ruined when he became essentially Wile E. Coyote to James Bond's Roadrunner in Moonraker, even becoming a good guy at the end with a dopey love interest to boot. They even let him talk. Actually, I have to say Richard Kiel's got a pretty good voice.
Well, here's to us.
Coming in at number 7, Goldfinger, the one who started it all. Auric Goldfinger, as played by Gert Frobe, was an imposing sight. With his German accent, which was actually dubbed because Gert Frobe's German accent was actually too heavy for the role, and a Humpty Dumpty look, Goldfinger was the first James Bond villain that was larger than life, right down to his obsession with gold.
This is gold, Mr. Bond. All my life I've been in love with its color, its brilliance, its divine heaviness.
Some of the dialogue here is unbelievable, and I always get a kick out of his death scene. Also, he had a really cool henchman of his own, Oddjob, but this is the one time the henchman didn't overshadow the villain.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Number 6, another hench person, but man, a really hot one. Xenia Onatopp, as played by Famke Janssen. Wow. I mean, I don't think nowadays you'd be able to do a PG-13 James Bond movie where the henchwoman orgasms when she kills people with her thighs. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But Famke Janssen is so over the top and great in this role. I mean, look at her. She's absolutely gorgeous, and you can tell that Pierce Brosnan, or James Bond, I guess, really wants to, you know, have sex with her throughout most of the movie, even if she's evil. Who can blame him? But it's a really good part. I think that Janssen's great in it. I can see why she was one of the few few women to star in James Bond movies that actually kind of escaped the curse of the Bond girls, because she went on to have a really good career. Because the fact is, she's actually a really solid actress. She's terrific in this role, and some of the dialogue and the acting is just terrific. I think Xenia on the Top is just an absolute scene stealer.
Wait for your turn.
Coming in at number 5. This is interesting because this is the first shadow James Bond character on my list. Red Grant, as played by Robert Shaw in From Russia with Love. Now, he's a really physically imposing guy with his bleach blonde hair and his physical build, which makes him pretty much the exact, kind of clone in some ways of Sean Connery, because they're built in almost exactly the same way. And he's kind of like Bond in a lot of ways. He's just as smart as he is, he's just as physically capable, but he has no morality at all. He works for Spectre, and he's as invaluable to them as James Bond is to MI6. At the end of the movie, when they fight on the Orient Express, it's a real nail-biter because they both seem like they're kicking the shit out of each other, and it's so good. I think Robert Shaw is such a good actor and probably could have played James Bond. If you watch him when he's pretending to be Colonel Nash, he's all smooth and sophisticated. He really could have played the part, but man, does he ever make for a good villain.
I get a kick out of watching the great James Bond, find out what a bloody fool he's been making of himself. We're pros, Mr. Bond.
Coming in at number 4, Javier Bardem's Silva, who I talked about a couple weeks ago in my James Bond Revisited on Skyfall. Like Red Grant, he's another shadow James Bond. He was a secret agent with a great relationship with Judi Dench's M, but he was betrayed and left physically disfigured after being tortured by the Chinese, and now he wants revenge. Bond has been betrayed several times, but always kind of shrugs it off because he's honor-bound. Silva is not and wants revenge, and the ending of this movie is really powerful because you have Javier Bardem at the top of his game, acting opposite Judi Dench and Daniel Craig, neither of whom are slouches. Plus, they've got an amazing director, Sam Mendes. It's emotional, it's operatic. I think that he is terrific in this movie.
You see what comes of all this running around, Mr. Bond? All this jumping and fighting. It's exhausting.
Coming in at number 3, one of my favorite modern James Bond villains, and one that also might be a little bit controversial on this list, Robert Davi as Franz Sanchez in License to Kill. Now, what I really like about this part is that in the 80s, you see drug-dealing villains were kind of all the rage, but they were always played as psychotic. Sanchez, while definitely a sadist, as you can see by his introduction where he whips Lupe, is probably not psychotic. You see, the thing that's interesting about him is that you can really see that the character inspires loyalty among his men, specifically Benicio del Toro's Dario, who I think is actually quite a good henchperson in this movie. He looks like a kid, and in fact Del Toro was only about 21 when it was made, but you can really tell that he loves Sanchez and looks up to him like a big brother or a father, and Sanchez is very loyal to him. He doesn't want to give him up, and his life is more important to him than money. That's the thing about Sanchez. Loyalty is the most important thing to him above all things. And it's pretty amazing. There's a scene where Dario is being shredded at the end by Pam Bouvier, and he's just screaming out Sanchez over and over and over again because he wants his friend or his mentor to come and save him, but it doesn't happen. And I almost kind of felt bad for Sanchez because you can tell he actually, in a weird way, wants to be friends with James Bond, because when he thinks that Bond's a mercenary, he kind of sees himself in it and wants to build him up to be kind of like the number 2 man in his corporation. But of course, he's evil, he's a drug dealer, he's gotta die. And Robert Davi really gave his performance his all, because I think Davi, in some ways, wanted to be a leading man, and in fact would star in a lot of movies after this. It's funny, John Glenn said that in the audition for Talisa Soto, he had Robert Davi acting as James Bond, and he said, you know what, he wasn't half bad. Coming in at number 2, Sean Bean as 006 in GoldenEye. Now, the interesting thing about Sean Bean was that he was one of the finalists to actually take over the role and could have easily played James Bond. But I think what made him cool as 006 is that he really does feel kind of like the other side of a coin for James Bond. He's just one rank ahead of him, but unlike Bond, he doesn't have that unassailable loyalty to the British Empire. In fact, his family, being Lien's Cossacks, were betrayed by the government, and he wants revenge. He also wants revenge against Bond because by changing the detonators, he ended up with a scar. There's also kind of a warmness between them, which I think is really cool. And their fight scene at the end is unbelievable because these are two guys that are clearly in their physical prime and just equally trained. It's so good, and I remember getting really excited for Pierce Brosnan as James Bond after the scene because he was so good in the fight scenes. Unfortunately, the James Bond movies that followed with Pierce Brosnan kind of devolved into just generic shoot-'em-ups, which is too bad. In some ways, the Daniel Craig James Bond movies delivered on the promise of GoldenEye.
Why can't you just be a good boy and die?
You first.
And coming in at number 1, who else could it be but Ernst Stavro Blofeld? Now, I'll give you this, not every actor that played Ernst Stavro Blofeld is good. When I'm talking about the best James Bond villains, I'm really talking about the early Blofeld. You know, the guy in the shadows with the signet ring and the cat in From Russia with Love and Thunderball, and then Donald Pleasance in You Only Live Twice. I mean, he really unnerved me as a kid with his bald head and his scar. You look in his eyes, he never blinks once, and that Nero jacket is very creepy. I think he was terrific, and I also really like Telly Savalas in kind of a different take on the role in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. He's still bald, he still wears a Nero jacket, but he doesn't have the scar, and he's a little bit more charismatic and a little bit more physically capable. He's still got the cat, but you actually don't see him holding the cat too much because I don't think the cat actually liked Telly Savalas or vice versa. However, the person that they got to play Blofeld afterwards in Diamonds Are Forever, Charles Gray, was an absolute disaster. Now, I like Charles Gray as an actor. He's fun in a kind of a camp way in Rocky Horror Picture Show, but he also plays Blofeld like he's in Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's such a camp performance that doesn't suit the movie at all. It's just terrible, and I think he was awful in the role. Now, of course, Blofeld did come back in a fashion in For Your Eyes Only, where Roger Moore drops him down a smokestack, but, you know, it's kind of a goofy, jokey scene that they just did as a dig at Kevin McClory. And in fact, Kevin McClory would have his revenge 2 years later when he would come out with Never Say Never Again, which would have Blofeld as played by Max von Sydow. Although I have to say, even though he's a great actor, doesn't make much of an impact as Blofeld. In fact, Klaus Maria Brandauer is much better in that as the other villain. Also, Barbara Carrera is really good in that. But, you know, I didn't really put any James Bond villains from Never Say Never Again on this list because they're not official James Bond villains. And of course, there's Christoph Waltz as Blofeld in Spectre, and I have to say, as a huge fan of Blofeld, I was very disappointed in his performance because Christoph Waltz is just too typical for that role. In fact, somebody suggested on my James Bond Revisited video on Spectre that they should have put Dave Bautista as Blofeld, and I think that kind of would have been amazing. I mean, he was great as Hicks the henchman, but man, if you watch Dave Bautista in some of his other movies like Blade Runner, you really kind of get the sense that he's an amazing actor, and man, he would have been so good as the villain in this movie. He would have really delivered something, and they just didn't allow him. They just cast him as a henchman because I think the casting choices in this one were a little bit narrow. But you know what? They've recast Blofeld before, they could recast him again. So I don't know, maybe give him a chance if it doesn't work out in No Time to Die, which of course features the return of Christoph Waltz's Blofeld in what I assume is actually going to be kind of a small role. Anyway, those are my top 10 favorite James Bond villains. I'm sure that a lot of you have different opinions than me. There were some that almost made the list but didn't quite make it. Of course, there was Dr. No, as played by Joseph Wiseman, but his role in the film is just too small for him to make the list. I also came very close to putting Christopher Lee on this for Francisco Scaramanga, but I just never liked his kind of scheme with the Solex agitator. It felt tacked on. And he's almost too sympathetic, and Bond is such an asshole in that movie. It's the only James Bond movie where I wanted the villain to win. Most of the Pierce Brosnan Bond villains are all kind of terrible, and probably the worst James Bond villains of all time, even though it's one of my favorite James Bond movies ever, strangely enough, is The Living Daylights with Yaron Krabe as Koskov and Joe Don Baker as Whitaker. I mean, these guys are terrible, but man, what a great movie. So join us next time here on James Bond Revisited, where we'll have another list for you, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. You'll have to tune in next week. And if you like this kind of content, make sure to click on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.